Jen Farley, and I believe that there is a rock star within all of us. So I'm reaching out to people and finding out what makes them a rock star in what they do. Today, I am talking to Regina Joskow, who is a publicist for musicians. So she helps rock stars really promote their rock star-ness, if you will. So welcome, Regina, to my little show. Thank you. So full disclosure, you are a colleague of my husband's.
I am.
Yes.
Very lucky to be so, since your husband is a total rock star.
Oh, he kind of is, isn't he? I'm a fan. I keep him around, I guess.
He's a good one. He's definitely a keeper.
Yeah, thank you. So tell me a little bit about what you do. You are a publicist?
I am. It's really changed over the years what we do. When I explain what I do in a nutshell, kind of the Reader's Digest abridged version, the basic upshot is we are the public face of the company to the media. So while my primary responsibility is getting people written about, getting people on TV, getting people on NPR, getting records reviewed, which is increasingly kind of going away in this internet age and this post-COVID age, we also are about creating images, building images, taking an artist's goal of what image they want to project to the world and helping them get there, whether it's through the media or just through the materials that we create. We help them with every aspect of creating their image, projecting their image, whatever it is. So everything from working with them on their bio, what details they want to share with the world, how to tell their story, how to tell the story of individual projects they're doing, what they want to project to the world as a visual image. So working with photographers, working with stylists, working with video directors, TV bookers, writing questions for an electronic press kit if they want to tell their story, working on everything from a song by song breakdown of the most recent album to just crafting a narrative around a record. I recently had an experience that was kind of unusual. I wanted to work with an artist on crafting the narrative of her album, which is more of a song cycle than just a straight ahead collection of songs, and clearly very, very deeply personal. And we talked about it, and she made clear that she wasn't comfortable revealing any of this. She didn't want to talk about what the songs were about. She didn't want to talk about what inspired the songs. And I said to her point blank, look, these days, a narrative surrounding an album, especially a song cycle that is this personal and this narrative based, will make the difference between whether people cover it or not. And she just kind of shrugged and said, well, I'm okay with that. I don't want to share, like, the music just needs to speak for itself. And I don't want to go in depth because it's just too personal and too painful. And I thought that was really interesting because clearly it was a cathartic experience for her to write these songs, record them, and want to share them with the world. But then she kind of threw up this wall and said, well, this artistic statement is just going to have to be out there on its own. So what we do is enhanced by how much an artist wants to participate, and also can be limited by how much an artist wants to put themselves out there or share. I mean, we frequently have artists who desperately want to do any interview that comes their way. And conversely, we have people who are completely phobic about talking to the press and don't want to do anything. So it's always an interesting balance to figure out.
Yeah, like you're really crafting the story and helping put it out there. Right. So it's hard. Obviously there's boundaries, and the creativity of that artist, like how you can be involved in that as well.
Right. So we kind of have to sense how much of themselves they're willing to put out there, how much of themselves they want to put out there. We serve two very distinct masters, as it were. On the one hand, we have a very deep responsibility to our artists and their managers. On the other, we have a very deep responsibility to our company, because that's who we work for and that's who we ultimately serve. And the goal is shared by everyone, but sometimes the way to get there can be in conflict, because we, of course, want, we're a business. We want to sell music. There's nothing bad about it, even though it's frequently portrayed that we are these kind of vampires sucking the lifeblood out of artists. When in point of fact, I don't know anybody that works at a record company or in music with the distinct goal of wanting to get rich or exploit artists. The reason we all get into this is because we love music. And I still can't believe that 35, 36 years on, someone pays me to talk about music. It's kind of mind-blowing. But again, there are times when we are in direct conflict, where our goals for an artist are in direct conflict with what they're willing or unwilling to do. I have artists who have not done a single interview in the last decade. I have artists that, again, will go to the opening of an envelope because they're so eager to participate in their own career. But there are some artists that simply don't want to, and they just lay that down. And it's really tricky. I actually would say that we serve a third constituency, which is writers and editors and producers.
Yeah.
And when I have to tell someone at the New York Times or the Los Angeles Times or a television show, no, I'm sorry, this person isn't doing any press whatsoever, doesn't always go over so well.
Yeah.
And especially when I need something from them and I go back to them the next time and say, hi, I've got this person coming in. Could you? And, I'll tell you one story that a booker at a major late night show who no longer is in the business. So it's okay to say this. In fact, the show isn't even, it was the Tonight Show many, many years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I had an artist who was booked on the Tonight Show, and she fell ill. She got really, really sick. And I had to cancel her engagement because she was in absolutely no shape to fly across the country to do a Tonight Show gig. And the booker was so angry with me. I offered her another A-list artist. This was a really A-list artist, like someone that everyone would have wanted to book. And I called her and apologized profusely and said, artist A is very, very sick. She can't fly. She has been absolutely prohibited from going anywhere, so we have to cancel. But I have this other artist in Los Angeles who can fill in, who's, amazing, has a brand new album out. Mm-hmm. She was so angry with me that she did not speak to me for over a year. She wouldn't take my calls, wouldn't respond to my emails, would not respond to pitches. And finally, I went to a florist in Los Angeles, the best florist around, and spent $400 on a dozen long-stemmed red roses. I faxed them a handwritten apology note and asked them to pin it to the front of the package so she would see it was in my handwriting, basically on my hands and knees, begging her for forgiveness. And after that, she picked up the phone and called me, and it was like nothing had ever happened.
Isn't that interesting too? Like, sometimes we don't realize our effect on other people. Like, she probably was angry, but she didn't, not picking up the phone ever.
Oh, it was unbelievable. And I had to sit in meetings every week, and people would say, so what has this person said? And I say, oh, yeah, I haven't heard from her, but for over a year.
Yeah.
And out of desperation, I finally thought, let me send her flowers and an apology note and just throw myself on her mercy.
Uh-huh.
And a few days later, the phone rang and it was her, like nothing had ever happened. Hey, just checking in, wanted to find out about this. And I thought, but I mean, how crazy is that?
Right. So I want to go back to why you started in this business for the love of music.
Oh God, I was just one of those music obsessed kids. I grew up in the Bronx. My parents were immigrants. They weren't really all that interested in music. I mean, they had a pretty decent record collection, but we didn't go to concerts or anything. I was just, as long as I can remember, I was absolutely obsessed with music. I had a little transistor radio and I would go to sleep every night with it under my pillow playing. And my very practical immigrant father would be livid in the morning because I would go to him with a dead battery in my radio, with tears in my eyes, asking for another battery. And he would say to me, "Do you think I work to pay Duracell? Is this what you think? Batteries are expensive." And I would just be so like, but my radio. So it started that way and just kind of progressed from there. I would spend every penny of my after work school job money on records and eventually concert tickets and magazines. I would be at the newsstand every week when the Village Voice came out, just itching to grab that and figure out who was playing and what was going on. So that was my life up until I was in my teens, and then started doing a fanzine and then started writing for other friends' fanzines. And I wanted to be a writer. I majored in English and communications in college. And I got my very first job within weeks of graduating was at a brand new magazine. It had just launched in May of that year, Spin Magazine. And I got a job as the assistant to the executive editor. And I thought that I had just died and gone to heaven. It was a really interesting time for Spin because even though it was funded by Penthouse, Bob Guccione Sr., it was a pretty kind of the barn's free, let's put on a show kind of operation. I mean, like we sat in canvas directors' chairs and the desks were the equivalent of like IKEA tables, folding tables. But it was a really, really exciting time to be launching a magazine. And I wanted to write. We had this investigative journalist who was doing really hard-hitting pieces about people like Sly Stone and David Crosby. And my boss handed me a list and said, "I want you to call up these people, tell them about Ed Kirsch, send over copies of the magazine, and see if any of them might want to interview Ed." And I said, okay. I mean, I was a kid. I knew nothing about how anything worked, but I just started calling people. And at the end of that first day, I went to my boss and said, okay, so this local news show wants to do something with Ed, and this person wants to interview Ed, and this person also expressed an interest. And he looked at me and said, wait, what? And I said, what? Did I do something wrong? This is what you asked me to do. You asked me to get people to talk to Ed, and I faxed the articles over and called them up and talked to these producers. And did I do something wrong? And he kind of furrowed his brow and grabbed me by the hand and took me down to Bob Guccione Jr.'s office and said, "Bob, we have our new publicist." And I said, I don't, what does a publicist do? I don't follow. I mean, I want to write. And he said, "There's plenty of writing in publicity. Don't worry about it." And from that moment on, that was my job. And that was it. And then when I left Spin in mid 1986, I got a job working for both Frontier Records and Roadrunner Records, launching Roadrunner's US company, and just started doing publicity. And again, I couldn't believe I was making $200 a week doing publicity for Roadrunner, and I could not have cared less because I couldn't believe that someone was paying me to talk to journalists about music.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I got started. And then Atlantic launched their alternative department in late 1987. And I got a phone call from the person who was running it. He asked if I wanted to come in for an interview. And I kind of scoffed because I was this little hipster kid. And I thought, Atlantic? I mean, Atlantic used to be cool, but now it's all those hair metal bands on MTV. And I went in and met with him and just fell head over heels in love. I just thought he was the greatest. So I went to work there, and we launched the first major label alternative department in the country. And I got to work with a lot of really great artists. And I was off to the races after that and just never looked back.
That's amazing. It's amazing that you're able to combine your passion with, you know, with a vocation, with a job,
I got
and with your
incredibly
talents.
lucky. It was really just dumb luck, honestly.
How do you connect with that feeling of being a rock star and doing what you do?
It's interesting. I'm sure you've experienced this with your husband. Publicity is one of those businesses where we suffer from imposter syndrome like
Mm,
nobody's business. And so much of it is contingent upon, even though in my own life, I don't really need external validation. In my professional life, we absolutely do, because we see what other publicists are getting and what other artists are getting. And we not only get that kind of pressure from our bosses and artist managers who regularly will say, well, so and so is on the cover of this magazine, so and so got SNL, so and so is on Colbert. Why can't my artist be there? But also, when we have a project that, for whatever reason, even if we're completely convinced that it should be doing far, far better, and it just doesn't connect, it doesn't work, we feel like we are the worst publicist in the world and it's all on us. And if someone else were doing it, it would be a huge success. Conversely, when we get those little triumphs, like John Perellis calls and says, I want to do a feature on your artist in the New York Times Arts and Leisure section, the serotonin boost from that is enough to keep you going for a week, quite literally. It's unbelievable when one of the big targets comes in, whether it's CBS Sunday Morning
mm.
or Colbert or the New York Times. You just feel like you just won the frickin' lottery. And the high from that is enough to make all that other stuff fall by the wayside for a minute. So that, I would say, is probably the greatest rock star feeling, when we're able to pull off one of those. But when things don't go well, it's really kind of dark. It's like someone putting out a record and everyone panning it is the equivalent of what we go through.
Yeah.
And we convince ourselves that it's on us,
Yeah.
you know. And had we framed the story differently, had we just gone to the right targets, had we just done something differently, it would be a whole different story. But, you know, so we beat ourselves up a lot.
Yeah. How do you shift the narrative in your head?
It's really difficult. I mean, now we've been able to do it with other artists. We've been able to kind of rehabilitate some people's reputations, or just some people. Just I'm working with a singer who early in her career wanted to be a very mainstream pop singer in the vein of Whitney Houston. And many, many years later, she reappeared on the scene, completely reinvented as this very serious student of Americana. Her music very much steeped in traditional R&B and blues. And it was fascinating because it worked, and people kind of didn't associate her with her former career. So it's possible to do. It's possible to completely reinvent yourself. And I mean, I know other artists who've done it as well. Take Billy Strings, for instance. Billy, who once upon a time was playing heavy metal and is now seen as one of the preeminent bluegrass artists of his generation. And I've worked with other artists who started out in heavy metal, like Tigran Hamasyan, who's a brilliant jazz pianist from Armenia, who played in a heavy metal trio for a really long time and then decided that jazz was his true vocation and is now one of the most respected jazz pianists on the scene. So you just never know.
Yeah. So tell me about the artists that you're working with now. And you're working with Rounder, that's
I
right?
work with Rounder and Concord. We merged. We are part of the greater Concord company, which is home to a bunch of incredible labels, including Fantasy and Concord Jazz and Stax, the historic R&B label. And Rounder was founded in 1970 up in Boston and was primarily a bluegrass and roots label. And Concord, of course, has a really storied history. And now we have merged the two. So some of the artists I'm working with now include Alison Krauss. She and Robert Plant have reunited after, what is it now, 13 years,
Wow.
14 years to make a follow-up to their 5-time Grammy-winning album, Raising Sand. So Raise the Roof is coming in November. We are very excited about it. We work with Billy Strings, who is an absolute dream. Sarah Jarosz is another artist who's been with us for a very long time. She came to us via another merger through Sugar Hill Records. And we just adore Sarah, 4-time Grammy winner by the time she was 28 years old. I saw her last night and she's just incredible. We have Indigo Girls, who, again, another iconic artist. We just signed Tears for Fears, which we're very excited about. Tears for Fears are back and the new record is going to knock people out. It's really kind of thrilling. If someone's a Tears for Fears fan from back in the day, they're going to be very happy. We are working with, Sierra Farrell and Katie Pruitt, who are both young up-and-comers from Nashville. And we've got Rustin Kelly, an incredible singer-songwriter who is also based in Nashville. There's so much. So it's a lot. Balancing all of those things, trying to, like, when you're at the beginning of 3 projects and then you've got 3 that are in the middle and then 3 that are kind of winding down, it gets a little tricky. But I'm very, very lucky that I can rely on so many stellar independent publicists out there, because I'm a department of one, which is another change that's taken place in the industry. When I started at Atlantic, the publicity department employed, I believe it was around a dozen people, and every artist was in-house. Everything was handled by the in-house staff at the label. There were no indies that we worked with. Indie publicity at the time was really reserved more for celebrities, not as much for artists on labels, unless you need a little bit of extra help when someone was out on the road and you needed to send someone out on the road with them. But even then, I think about the fact that we handled everything in-house at Atlantic. There were no projects that were out with indies. So Genesis, Robert Plant, Pete Townsend, all those artists were in-house. And that was true pretty much across the board. So, everything from the Rolling Stones to Led Zeppelin to all those superstar rock acts had publicists that were in-house, that were responsible for them. But as the record industry kind of shifted, and especially with the rise of just digital, illegal downloading and all that stuff, when the money started to kind of trickle out and we started losing sales, and then with the advent of the internet and streaming and the business model shifting to streaming instead of people owning music, departments across the board have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. So when I was at Verve Records, when I first went there, I had a department of 5 people. by the end of my decade-long tenure there, I was the sole member of the department.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just how it went. And of course, it makes perfect sense that as in-house departments got smaller and smaller, it gave rise to so many indie firms that
Right.
just got bigger and bigger. So things kind of shifted away from in-house publicity, and it almost became kind of a prestige thing for artists when they wanted to sign, that negotiating independent publicity was part of their contract, unless they were with a label that had a very robust in-house team that was able to execute a big campaign. When you look at something like the Plant Krause project, it's kind of an all hands on deck thing, because there's so many moving parts that if we didn't have a 3-person outside team on it, we just couldn't handle the workflow, you know?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I mean, and obviously there's other changes. You're working from home and, you know,
yes.
the face of how people get their music is totally a different landscape.
Oh, and there are people who are kicking and screaming and utterly resistant to it. It's really interesting, because when I first started in the business, we used to send out advance cassettes. We used to physically mail out about 400 cassettes on any release. And we also used to mail out press releases, which is kind of funny to think about, that we would, first class mail press releases, which usually have some level of urgency.
Mhm.
And as I said to you earlier, communication was totally different too. We would call people up and say, did you get the advance I sent you on this and that? It's coming out in 6 months, because lead times were so different then. Magazine lead times were at the minimum 4 months. Typically, we'd be out 6 months ahead of a release to start setting press up. All of that has changed so drastically. And because of environmental concerns and the cost of manufacturing CDs, shipping CDs, and the fact that most advances wind up in landfills, we have entirely stopped doing advance physical product and have cut back severely on the number of promos we send out. These days, we primarily service music via download link. I don't really think that it's been the best thing for music to be delivered in this way, because quite frankly, MP3s just don't sound as good. We're all really used to it now. We're so used to listening to music on our computers. We're so used to the compression of MP3s that we've kind of, just for the sake of convenience, given up on the audiophile experience, as it were. But these are just sacrifices that we've had to make for, again, the environment and budgets and technology, and things work a lot. It's much easier and more economical now to send a press release to 1,000 people with a couple of keystrokes. But I think that overall, the quality of what we do has kind of suffered as a result.
Yeah.
And we don't have the same kind of relationships with writers that we did back in the day. I feel like an old woman shouting at a cloud, but we used to have really, really strong relationships with writers and editors who came to know us and knew who they could trust and who knew what they were talking about. And these days, I can't tell you how frequently I hear the complaint from editors that there are all these young publicists pitching them on stuff that they would never cover, like jazz magazines or jazz writers getting pitches for heavy metal artists or post-punk or goth artists or whatever it is, or vice versa, people at heavy metal magazines getting pitches from young publicists who are sending them things that they would never cover, straight ahead pop or jazz or what have you. And, we used to know what these writers cared about, and we'd get to know the individual writers and know, oh yeah, well, David Brown, very much into acoustic music, huge fan of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. I've got something that sounds kind of in that vein. I'll send it to him. You know, he's a Joni Mitchell scholar and he knows Laura Nero's music like the back of his hand. This would be a great fit for him. Mm-hmm. This would be a great fit for this NPR show, because I know that this producer loves this sort of thing. And oh, we've got this Stax box set and 3-night engagement at this venue. I know just the person to pitch at the Times who absolutely loves this music, you know, and we can't
You're able to
do that anymore. Yeah, we can't really, there's a little bit of that kind of individualized pitching that goes on these days, but not as much. And thanks to email, things of communication has gotten a lot drier, except in cases where we've known the people at these publications or these media outlets for a really long time, and we have that long-standing relationship with them. And also staying on top of what everyone is covering, which, you know, I have friends who are so much better about this stuff than I. They are just constantly checking what Pitchfork is covering, checking what NPR New Music Friday is covering. The minute that breaks, they're on it and listening to the whole thing. And then, you know, John Perellis does that playlist on Friday afternoons. It usually breaks around noon on Fridays, and they're just on it. And they're texting and saying, oh my God, did you see? And I'm like, no, because I'm really busy at work. And I feel that's, again, the imposter syndrome. I look at other friends of mine who are so much more on top of what people are covering. And it just makes me a little crazy, because I go, oh God, I'm missing out. I'm behind all of you. And so, which is why at 9:00 on a Wednesday night, you will see me scrolling through Twitter and searching music terms and looking up every major editor and producer and writer friend I have, looking to see, what are they talking about? What are they writing about? What are they excited about?
Which it's hard for you to end up like disengaging too. Like,
it's impossible. You can't anymore. Yeah. Once upon a time, when I tell this to, again, old woman sitting on a cloud, we used to knock off work, and most nights we would head downtown and go see music, because that's what we did. You know, 4 or 5 nights a week, we were going to shows at CBGB or the Ritz or wherever in Manhattan. But that was the trajectory, is you'd get out of work at 6:00, some nights much later, depending on what was going on. But on average, you'd leave work at 6, you'd go grab a quick bite, you'd head downtown, and you would go out, and you wouldn't get home till God knows when. But you saw lots of great music, and all the people in your inner circle who like the same kind of music as you would see them night after night, most of whom also worked at labels, at magazines, at fanzines, at, you know, media outlets. So any given night I was at CB's, I would run into 20, 30 people I knew from various parts of the industry. And you saw the same people at Maxwell's, at CB's, you know, it was just the usual crowd, and you would engage that way too. And that was another way. You would never pitch someone in person, but you would bond over that shared experience of going to see music at these places, going to see the same bands. And it really kind of gave you a little bit of a leg up, but work would never call you after hours unless there was some kind of emergency, and your weekends were your own unless you had a band in town, in which case you always went to see the bands that were on your label. But it was a much more kind of social thing. There was not this.
Yeah.
You weren't frantically checking constantly and being interrupted by things pinging and ringing and buzzing. Weekends, same thing. I check my email constantly during the weekend. And there are times when my family gets really frustrated, because we'll be at the dinner table and, you know, I'll get a text and the text tone will go off, and I'll automatically go to pick up my phone, and they'll look at me and say, we're eating dinner. And my response is always, I have to check because I do, I don't really feel I have a choice. Because it could be something very important, could be something completely insignificant, but I do have to at least glance at my phone and determine, do I need to deal with this now or can it wait? It's just that the news cycle has changed. The cycle of everything has just changed completely and utterly because of social media, because of the availability of the 24-hour news cycle,
Right.
because of smartphones and texting and all of it, email, it's changed everything.
I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I know that you're super busy, and I honestly could listen to you talk and tell stories all day.
You're so sweet. I hope I haven't bored you stupid.
Not at all. I find it so fascinating. I do want to ask you, because I ask everyone, if there is a song that you would consider your Rockstar theme song. What song represents you?
Just One Victory by Todd Rundgren.
And why is that?
We need just one victory and it'll be all right. It just sums it all up. I mean, Todd says, you may feel about to fall, but I know the answer. And, shine and still to give us the will. It sounds really corny, but Todd's music is unquestionably the longest and most successful relationship of my life. I first heard Todd, I know I probably sound like a cult follower, but I first heard his music when I was 10 years old in 1972. And it was a total life-changing experience. And I have followed his music and his career since then. So, it's, 1972 to now, do the math. And he has never let me down. And he always pushes the envelope and just never gives up and never does the same thing twice, never repeats himself, and just follows his own muse. He was one of the first guys talking about technology. Todd was one of the first artists to embrace video technology. He was one of the first artists to embrace MIDI technology. He was one of the first to embrace the internet when he did TR1, which was a totally interactive platform for his fans. And when record companies stopped really serving his needs, he said, fine, I'll go do it myself. And he did. And this is a guy who has never, ever followed anyone else's path, but has been just completely steadfastly true to what was best for him and his music. And he has consistently shown his loyalty to his fans in every way imaginable. I mean, the guy just puts himself out there, and I couldn't possibly love him anymore. And I know I probably sound like I said, a cultist or a crazy stalker, but I wish that everyone had a Todd in their life if they're a music fan, because again, the guy has never let me down.
I think what's so fascinating to me about listening to you tell stories and connect with music is to actually feel the passion that you have for music, and that really showing how vital music is in all of our lives.
I never understand when I talk to people for whom music doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I sometimes feel, I know that we shouldn't use the word crazy, but I do. I sometimes feel like a crazy person when I admit, and I don't admit this to a lot of people, so I can't believe I'm doing this on a show that's going to be seen by people. But sometimes someone will say something and it will trigger a song in my brain. And I don't know if a lot of people are wired that way, but a word, an expression, something will just automatically trigger. And I think that's one of the things I like best about my husband is he understands it, because we sometimes will look at each other and say the same name, the name of a song out loud to one another at the same precise moment. It's kind of like the way some people quote something funny from a film.
Yep.
That they say over and over again. So I'll be walking down the street and I'll see something that makes me just start thinking about music. Like I'll see some really striking woman in a blue dress, and suddenly Devil with the Blue Dress On is playing in my head. And this happens constantly. And my husband and I joke about the iPod in our heads.
Regina, thank you so much for your time and
thank you.
Stories. Do you have anything that you want to plug that's coming up? Anything that you're working on?
Well, I will say that for people who think they don't like bluegrass music, who have made up their minds, I can't tell you how frequently that comes up, that someone will say to me, oh, I don't like country, or I don't like jazz, or I don't like bluegrass. And the truth of it is, it's only because they haven't found the right bluegrass or country or jazz record. I will tell everyone under the sun that they should listen to Sire Farrell, who is one of the most exciting, incredible young artists I've ever heard. I would say the same of Billy Strings, who is an absolute mind-blowing artist. We have an artist named Amethyst Kia, who I think is just a gift from the music gods. She's a really incredible young woman from Johnson City, who was in a group with Rhiannon Giddens called Our Native Daughters. And now she's made her first solo record, which is just astonishing. And on the jazz front, I think everyone should listen to Esperanza Spalding, because she is like no one else.
Yep. So I saw her live a few years ago, and it was mind blowing.
Exactly. I mean, you see that, and it like blows the top of your head off.
Yeah.
And gives you a whole new way of seeing everything, not just music. So
I loved listening to you
thanks
so eloquently about your stories and about music, because music is all powerful. So I appreciate it.
It really does have the power to change people's lives and to change the world. And thank goodness for it.